If you grew up in evangelicalism, you were told the consequences of not being a Christian were hell and punishment in the afterlife. There's no way to enter into that kind of relationship without coercion. Every sexual impulse was a threat to my salvation, the threat of hell. It was like, okay, this might be proof that I might not really be in, and I can't afford to not be in. The stakes are just way too high for that. The spirituality I inherited was kind of like, hey, this world is going to burn. It's really about the next world. I want a spirituality that makes my life better, that makes the world better, that helps people in the here and now.
You are listening to the Ockery Podcast, a show about men and masculinities, the challenges that modern men face, and how to chart a better way forward. I'm your host, Matt Howlett, mental health coach and founder of the Ockery. Brian Recker is a former Marine officer, the son of a Baptist preacher, and an alum of the fundamentalist Bob Jones University. Brian spent 8 years as an evangelical pastor before deconstructing his faith to find a more inclusive spirituality. He now speaks about following Jesus without the fear of hell and has written about this in his new book, HellBent, How the Fear of Hell Holds Christians Back from a Spirituality of Love. We talk about why he deconstructed his faith and what spirituality looks like to him now. He shares why he believes that hell isn't real and that love should be radically inclusive, as demonstrated through the life and teachings of Jesus. The conversation also covers why men need an authentic spirituality, why the Western world has an empathy problem, why a spirituality of hell creates a divided self, and why the Sears catalogue made him question his faith as a teenager. As someone who also grew up in an evangelical church and used to be a pastor, I found this conversation and Brian's book, HellBent, to be a very refreshing and liberating take on what true spirituality is and what's really important in this life, not just as a man, but as a society. Here's the conversation with Brian Recker. I'd love to just read a clip from your book that's coming out, and it's September 30th, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. So it's called HellBent, How the Fear of Hell Holds Christians Back from a Spirituality of Love. And the clip that I wanted to read is towards the beginning of the book. It says, growing up, I believed that every person was going to stand before God when they died. God, who I imagined as a 1,000-foot-tall, faceless, glowing man in a chair, would open up the book of life, and if someone's name wasn't in it, God would say, "Depart from me, I never knew you," and send that sorry son of a bitch to hell. So
Poor fella.
Yeah, poor fella. I have a vivid memory. Maybe I have a story I can tell you later where my idea of hell came from, but your idea of all this changed. What can you just give us some context for that? Like what exactly happened? You were an evangelical pastor. You grew up fundamental Baptist.
Yeah, so what I described there was from my fundamental Baptist upbringing, where hell was really front and center in most of, the sermons. It was what you'd call fire and brimstone,
Right.
kind of a classic thing, which, evangelicals believe very similar things to fundamentalists, but they approach it in quite different ways. The difference is more in vibes than anything.
Okay.
And so evangelicals are typically trying to be seeker sensitive. And so they don't talk about hell every week because they don't want to be weird or scare people away, but they really still believe that the same long list of people are going there as fundamentalists. They just don't talk about it as often. And what always just seemed obvious to me was that if you believe this to be true, then it's a bad thing, not a good thing, if you're not talking about it. Because you should really be warning people if you actually believe that this is sort of their horrific fate. And that was what we taught in fundamentalism. And so while I don't appreciate their fear-mongering spirituality, I do have to at least acknowledge their integrity, that if they really believe that most of the people who are currently alive are going to go to hell, because really anybody who's not a Christian, according to their specifications, and by best estimates, a third of humanity would consider themselves Christian. But
Right.
according to fundamentalists, not even all of those would necessarily qualify, because some of them would be nominal Christians,
Yep.
or maybe Catholics, which maybe wouldn't quite qualify. So they really believe that the vast majority of people are going to hell. And so when they are constantly going around and, maybe think of a street preacher on a corner who's aggressive and annoying, and yet he would say that he's doing the most loving thing possible, because if you were watching somebody who was about to be struck by a truck in the street and you weren't calling out, get out of the way,
Yeah.
you just let them get hit by that truck. Hell is like the big truck that's going to hit everybody. And so if they really believe that, they should be screaming about it.
Yeah,
The
that makes
problem
sense.
with that, though, is it creates just a very toxic spirituality.
Yeah, I feel that. I don't know if I mentioned to you in our chats prior to the call, but I was a pastor as well for
Oh, wow.
just about a decade. Yeah. Went to Bible college, studied theology and music. I was more interested in the music side, but I started working with students, my first couple positions. But yeah, this book and what I've read so far, and especially what you just said, resonated very deeply with me. And I think it's going to resonate with a lot of people. So what exactly do you believe now when it comes to spirituality?
Well, it's a very broad
Yeah,
term,
obviously.
but no, I can tell you that. Yeah. So
We'll get into it a bit deeper.
Jesus did make it simple, actually. In some ways, I don't have, for me, when hell was a part of my spirituality, certainty was really important.
Mhm.
And if you have to make sure that you believe the right things, and if you believe the wrong things, you might be punished in eternity, then it's very important to be sure that that's not going to happen to you. Like I was always struggling with what I called assurance of my salvation in my early years in fundamentalism. And, I prayed that sinner's prayer many times over to sort of have that sense of surety. And the reality is, though, when fear is the foundation of your spirituality, it's really impossible to be sure, because the reality is this is not the kind of thing anyone can know for sure. What happens when you die is not the kind of thing that you can be certain about.
Yeah.
And so when hell is a part of that scenario, you kind of have to manufacture certainty, because you really want to feel sure that that's not going to happen to you or your loved ones. And so I would say certainty is no longer a part of my spirituality. Instead, the center of my spirituality is love. And Jesus actually, makes this quite simple, because every time somebody asks Jesus, like, what's this whole thing about? What's the big idea? How do you kind of whittle this down into like the core principle? Like what's the whole law and the prophets about? What's the whole Bible about? Jesus said multiple times that the whole law and the prophets can really be summed up with those commands to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And this was kind of Jesus's repeated refrain, was bringing it all back to the love command. And so for me, I am less concerned with what's the right answer. What can I absolutely know for certain? And for me, instead, a better question is, what is helping me grow in love? And so anything that leads me deeper into love, anything that helps me feel more connected to myself, to God, and to other people, I would say is spiritual for me.
Yeah, I'm imagining that you would get a lot of pushback from evangelical Christians about, like, well, what is God? Who is God? What does that even look like? And that is a pretty fundamental concept, and in Christianity is the concept of hell. Not necessarily just punishment, but this idea that there is a heaven and hell, that there is this dichotomy, and that if you don't have Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, is the language we always used, right, then you're going to go to one place or the other, right, based off of that fact, right? So what do you say to that? Has that been an easy conversation? Have people kind of understood this like process of deconstruction that you've been through?
I definitely think that for many evangelicals, those assumptions are so core and fundamental that it is tough to really challenge them until you're ready to question the whole system. Because that is really what I discovered, was it's not as easy. When I first started to do a deep dive on what the Bible says about hell, I was an evangelical pastor still. And one of the problems that you run into is that if you start to look at the Bible and you start to recognize that it's not actually that clear on a literal place called hell, that, in many places it actually seems like, man, actually this is maybe more of a metaphor. Maybe this is more about our behavior in this life and not punishment in the afterlife and that sort of thing. But the problem with that, if you start to say, hey, maybe this isn't all about the afterlife, maybe this isn't all about hell, the problem with that is it's like pulling on a thread and recognizing that it starts to kind of unravel the whole sweater of Christianity, because many of us inherited a Christianity that binary that you described was really the whole ballgame. That was the whole, if there is no hell to be saved from, then what's the point of Christianity? What's the point of having a savior? So what's the point of, one of the most common questions I get when I talk about the fact that I don't believe the Bible teaches in a literal hell is, well, if there's no hell, then what's the point of Jesus at all? Like, why believe in any of it? Which to me is actually quite revealing, because it actually is revealing that avoiding punishment is foundational in in that spiritual framework. And I don't want a spirituality that's primarily about avoiding punishment in the afterlife. I want a spirituality that helps me live into love in this life for the sake of the world.
Yeah.
And so when that's not the main idea, and that can't be the main, if there's anything as looming in front of us as horrific, as eternal, as and ongoing. I mean, it's the worst possible punishment for the longest possible amount of time. It's the worst thing that could possibly happen.
It sounds like it, yeah.
It can't possibly be a secondary issue. If that is a real thing, it's going to crowd out every other spiritual priority. And so it's kind of odd then when you realize, like, Paul, who wrote over half the New Testament, didn't even mention hell. And that I don't believe that you can have a healthy spirituality if fear is the main driving motivation. And if hell is real, then fear must be the main driving motivation for our very relationship with God.
Yeah.
I point out sometimes that evangelicals love to talk about like a relationship with God. Like that's the whole thing that they'll say is this isn't a religion, it's a relationship.
I said that many times. Yeah.
Have you said that one?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But what kind of dawned on me was that for the vast majority of us, that very relationship began with hell. For the most, when I'll talk to people when I talk about my book. Just this last weekend, I did kind of I was at a festival and did a little talk on my book, and I had a group of people there, and I had them all stand up. I was like, well, I said this. I said, if you've been saved at some point in your life, you were converted or born again or accepted Jesus into your heart, like one of those things happened to you, stand up. And I think pretty much everybody there stood up because it was kind of a Christian sort of event, although it was like a progressive Christian event. But so everybody stood up, and I said, okay, if when you made that decision to be converted or be born again or to accept Jesus into your heart, if when you made that decision, hell was in your awareness as a part of that story, that was a part of your reason for making that decision. Like you understood that the consequences for not being born again, for not being saved, was that you would go to hell. If that was a part of your understanding when you were converted, stay standing. And like one person sat down, I think. Everybody else stayed standing. So that was a part of that mental model for making that decision. And then I said this, I said, okay, if that decision, conversion, accepting Jesus into your heart, being born again, if that happened before you were 10 years old, stay standing. And like 2 people sat down. So like 80%, 90% of the people were still standing up. And that was my story as well. And that was, I think, a pretty good majority of people. If you grew up in evangelicalism, you probably had a conversion experience as a child where you were told the consequences of not being a Christian were hell and punishment in the afterlife. And so this choice, which is being presented to you as a child, is really no choice at all. And that is the relationship with God. But any other relationship in your life, if you're told, hey, this is a beautiful, life-giving relationship. And in fact, this is the most loving relationship you can possibly have. It's going to change your life. This is the best relationship. It's beautiful. It's pure love itself. But also, if you're not in that relationship, you're going to be eternally tortured. That is really it's a toxic relationship. There's no way to enter into that kind of relationship without coercion.
Yeah. And that's not the way that you want to go into anything like that. Like when you were talking there, it was making me think of all the times when like you give like a child a gift, you're at like a birthday party or whatever, and the parent reminds the child to say thank you, or reminds the child to say whatever, go over and give your uncle a hug and say thank you, right? It's like, I appreciate that. I'm an uncle. I've given children gifts. I've had that experience myself. You always appreciate that. It's cute. And I recognize that that's part of, just teaching a child manners and stuff like that. But you also recognize as an adult that they don't get it quite yet, right? They're doing it because they're told to do it. They're not doing it because they, in that moment love the gift or want to say thank you to you. They're learning something, right? And my experience, I'm pretty sure it sounds like, at least, is very similar to yours. I had that conversion experience, and I'll tell you what I mentioned earlier. It was called Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames.
Oh, no.
Oh, you've seen that? Okay.
I haven't actually seen it myself, but I've heard all about it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're like.
I wrote my terror, book for people that have basically. Yeah. It's just basically an experience of pure terror, because if you're young enough, obviously, if you're a little older, I think you can perceive it, process it a little bit differently, but still the whole purpose of that play, this was like early 90s, if I remember correctly. I think I was like 11 when I saw this, but the whole purpose is to show that dichotomy, to show that, heaven's beautiful, heaven's awesome, like your loved ones are there, and it's like all lights and gold, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful spot. No pain, no crying, no nothing, right? And then hell, lights go out. You hear the demonic screams being played through, like, the ghetto blaster or whatever they had there back in the school gymnasium. I was terrified. I remember that moment. I remember where I sat. There was a bunch of round tables. I remember who I talked to, about my faith in that decision. But I had grown up in the church. It was all I ever knew.
And how can we not think that really, I think one of the points of my book is to say that introduction to the faith, when that's the foundation, I don't think you can just go on and say, oh, but this is actually all about love. That's kind of a kind of gaslighting, is what I point out in the book, to say, like, you have to agree with this or else you're going to be eternally tortured. And that's like the baseline for entrance. And then on the other side of that, to say, hey, this is just a regular loving relationship. This is actually the most loving relationship. If in the back of your mind, that you can't leave it, it can't be freely chosen. And so I just think we need to be honest about that we're shaping a spirituality. And we're also, I still do think it matters what you believe about God, but not because I think God's going to punish you if you're wrong. I think it matters because what you believe about God is what you believe about reality. And it really shapes the kind of person you become. And so if God is a punisher and God sits on a throne saying you're in, you're out, he's the ultimate excluder, essentially, creating a binary universe, then it really gives you permission to be a punisher and to be an excluder. And
sure.
So I think we can draw a pretty direct line between, having this God who, casts people out. And then, we have things like alligator Alcatraz now, where, the Christians in America are perfectly content to gather up immigrants and put them in these concentration camps. And I mean, what is hell if not the ultimate concentration camp? In fact, one time I created a video where I talked about the inclusivity of God, and I ultimately said something about universalism, which I would be a universalist, and they were basically like, or when I was talking about the welcoming the outsiders, and they basically said, you think countries shouldn't have walls, but God has walls around heaven. Like, not a single unbeliever is going to get into there. Like, God is the ultimate, in a sense, gatekeeper, and there's no illegal immigration. That's what they said. There's no illegal immigration from hell to heaven, right? And so that was giving them justification, spiritual justification, to take that punitive mindset. You have this punitive God, and you're now working that out into the way that you view other people and view the world. And so it does create, I think, a spirituality. And so that's what I'm hoping to help people deconstruct, is we need better foundations for our spirituality.
So I would assume one of your foundations is still God. What is that for you? I noticed in the book.
What's God?
Yeah, well, it's obviously a big topic. We could go down several different rabbit trails, but I'm just looking for some, small encapsulation, because, like, if you're breaking down Christianity and you're removing the concept of hell, there's some aspects of that there's some holes that kind of feel like they need to be filled in. Pulling that out creates some gaps.
Yeah. So my first image of God, you mentioned the 1,000-foot glowing guy in a chair. That came from the Chick Track gospel tracks. Have you seen those ever? I have, yeah. And there's like a classic image, which really was my mental model for God. And it was a big guy on a throne, and really a big punishing guy. He was the guy that you were going to stand before, and he was going to tell you if you were in or out. And I think for many Christians, they kind of do think about God as a big guy, a big punishing guy. And I that makes sense because, well, that's a God that we, it's easy to conceptualize something. And there are images in the Bible that do lead to that.
The Old Testament is filled with that. Yeah.
Say that.
Sorry, the Old Testament is filled with that.
For sure. I do think we see an evolution in the conceptualization of God. And we're meant to, as Christians, we're meant to take our ultimate picture of what God is like and who God is from Jesus. And I think that one of the problems with inerrancy and really believing that every single thing in the Bible is equally authoritative is that what you'll end up doing is you kind of have to fit all of those pictures together, and the bad ones kind of tend to win out. as opposed to seeing that there are actually contradictions, and actually there is a movement within Scripture and an evolution of even how we're meant to perceive God. And so there are pictures towards the beginning of the Bible where God is very much a tribal God. He's a God. The Yahweh is portrayed as sort of the God of one nation, as opposed to and in sort of combat with the gods of other nations. Right. This is our God versus their God, and that sort of thing. But ultimately, even within the Hebrew prophets, prophets like Isaiah, they talk more about a universal God who really is the God of all people, and that the trajectory is always towards a more universal picture. To really the ultimate sort of defining moment really comes at the very end of the Bible, where we hear that God is love, which is the most universal thing of all. Love is for everyone and is the inheritance of all people. And I do think Jesus came to reveal a God of love. And so I learn what God is like by what Jesus is like. Mm-hmm. And Jesus reveals a God of compassion and mercy. And ultimately, God, although Jesus uses language like Father to describe God, when Jesus describes what that Father is like, he's often actually turning even patriarchal norms upside down. He reveals like a different kind of father, a father like in the parable of the prodigal son, who runs out to meet his wayward son and shows immediate compassion and mercy, even not this authoritative sort of judge or punisher, but actually a God of compassion. In fact, there's several moments in the Gospels as well where Jesus even takes an Old Testament sort of syllogism, where in the Old Testament it talks about be holy, for I am holy.
Right.
And Jesus says, be ye merciful, for God is merciful. And so actually even replaces holiness with mercy as the primary characteristic of God. And so I do ultimately believe in a God who's purely love. And what some, I think, people would have to do if hell is in your worldview, then your definition of love has to include hell. In other words, well, God is love, but God does send some people to hell, which means that it can actually be loving to send people to hell. So what that ends up doing is actually mutates the very definition of love into something that is very unlike love, as opposed to having our conception of God being hinging on the idea of what we know love to be. We end up mutating love and making love into something punishing. Yeah. So that means an abusive parent, well, I'm being loving, even in my abuse. So our love can now include punishment. If the God of love can include punishment. Yeah. But I don't think we're supposed to do that, because Jesus never punished anyone. Whenever Jesus uses God's power, it's only ever to heal. It only ever works in that one direction. It never is to hurt. It's never to harm. It's never to punish. Yeah. And so I don't believe that that's who God is or what is in the character of God. So I have kind of thrown out that big punishing guy view of God. I don't think God is a guy. I don't think that God is like a sky daddy. I think of God as a universal spirit of love. I love Richard Rohr's definition. Richard Rohr says God is reality itself, reality with a personality. And so it matters what you believe about God, because if God is love, then reality is fundamentally loving as opposed to fundamentally punishing. And so it does shape how you even view the world, how you interact with the world. I think the world would be a better place if we believed the best about one another and about reality.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I loved about reading your book. Well, first of all, the whole thing was very refreshing, and I just really enjoyed hearing your take on several different things, because I haven't read anything really like that resonated so much since I've been through that process. Yeah, man, no, I really appreciate it. I was so glad to hear that you were free and interested to jump on with this today. But one of the things that I really think about this whole process of deconstruction, this conversation that you're having with so many different people, is when you break it down. Like, you can have all these theological conversations, you can talk about the Old Testament and the New Testament and whatever you want to do. But when you break it down, what is it that makes life better right now? Not just for yourself, but for everybody else around you and for the world on the whole. Yes. You know what I mean? And when we're focused about heaven and hell, we're focused about the future, and we don't even know if that's actually going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I want to get to know Brian Recker, right? Yeah. I want to read his book, and figure out whether or not I believe in what he believes in, and whether or not I can share that, and what that does for me, how that gives understanding to the experience that I've had, you know what I mean? Learn from you, and you can learn from me. That type of thing is what fills me up. That's where I find satisfaction in. And I just, there's so much division in the world right now, especially around religion. But we're focused on the things that I don't think matter all that much.
That don't connect us. Like what you just described was connection.
Exactly.
really, yeah, Thomas Merton has this beautiful quote. He says, personal relationships is what will save us. And I do think that it is all about relationships. That's another definition for God. Like when you say God is love, God is, you might even say relationship itself. That spirit of loving connection that does, I think, bind us all together. I want a spirituality that makes my life better, that makes the world better, that helps people in the here and now. And even when I think of, also just like the planet and the future of the planet and the people on it and the flourishing of this world and the people on it, we didn't really inherit a spirituality that was invested in that. It wasn't about making the world a better place, which seems crazy because that seems like the most obvious sort of low-hanging fruit. Like your spirituality should make the world a better place. No, actually, the spirituality I inherited was kind of like, hey, this world is going to burn. It's really about the next world. It wasn't about the flourishing of the people on the planet. And so to me, it's like if your religion doesn't touch that, doesn't touch makes a more peaceful, just, flourishing humanity.
Yeah.
Then you've got to start from scratch a little bit.
Absolutely. And I think people could throw out a lot of this and say it's just woo-woo, it's just feelings based, like, it's not, you're throwing away your faith. But like the science actually backs this up. I was actually listening to a podcast just the other day. It might have been Psychology Today. I can't remember exactly which one it was, but there's a PhD, I believe her specialty or her focus was in neuroscience. And she was talking about the mental health well-being benefits, like the trackable, hard data that they have from people with religious commitments and why like they were having these, different factors change. So whether it was like reduced blood pressure, reduced perceived stress levels, just overall well-being. I should have taken notes on the specifics of it, but she basically said it wasn't just religion. The people that were religious were identified as having, better health outcomes, but it wasn't just religion. It was the connection and the community and the purpose that gave them. So, you know what I mean? Like, is religion the only way to that? It can be helpful. I'm not ever like a proponent of throwing religion out the window, but I think the main thing that we need to be focused on is what you just said. Is connection with ourselves, with each other, and with whatever it is that we believe God to be, or the reality, the universe. And ultimately, I think that's what you're saying. It's love, it's connection.
And I don't think you have to stray outside of Jesus to even find that. I think this was very core to how Jesus approached things. Jesus put people first, not religious rules and arbitrary religious dogmas first. In fact, Jesus never teaches any dogmas ever. He never has his disciples sign up to any kind of statement of faith. He doesn't here's the like things that you really have to believe about God in order to be in. It's never about that. It's always about the flourishing of people. And it's always the religious leaders coming at Jesus saying, hey, like you broke this religious rule. Yeah, you're not following our dogmas and our laws and our rules. You broke the Sabbath, for instance, because he was healing on the Sabbath. And it's like, yeah, I'm going to heal on the Sabbath because that's what the whole thing is about. The whole thing is about healing. It's about flourishing. It says, is man made for the Sabbath, or was the Sabbath made for man? In other words, this principle of rest, of course, this is important because it leads to the flourishing of humankind. But when it's not, when it's getting in the way of flourishing, it's like, oh, for the sake of the rule, we're not going to heal. It's like, no, now this is actually standing in the way of the flourishing. And so he always was like, yeah, you can throw that away because the point was always people.
Yeah.
And rather than learn that lesson, we have brought in, and maybe most Christians don't follow Sabbath because they're like, oh, Jesus broke the Sabbath, so we don't have to worry about the Sabbath. So they throw that one away, but they have other religious rules that they'll hold on to because those ones are the ones that really, no, the whole point was that it was always meant to be people first, which is why even when it comes to conversations like queer inclusion, we can argue about Bible verses all day long about what this verse means, what that verse means. Oh, maybe this is actually about pederasty, not homosexuality, et cetera, et cetera. But actually what I care about most is like what leads to wholeness, health, flourishing for people. And the data tells us that actually when queer people are in affirming, accepting environments, they flourish. And when they're in non-affirming environments, they commit suicide. They're depressed at higher rates. Like, they have bad outcomes. It's not good for people. And so that, to me, Bible verses aside, I think we can see just from the trajectory of what Jesus was teaching us of what really matters. The point isn't we have to make them all obey some arbitrary religious standard that's disconnected from human flourishing. No, if the data is telling us that this way is leading to death and this way is leading to life, that's all I care about. I want a religion of life.
Yeah. I feel like it goes against even just common sense to be digging into specific scriptures and worried about the interpretation of this or of that when you realize that you've got a human here that we're called to love, I would say, above all else. We're not called to just follow rules and religious rites and whatever it's going to be to figure out like what's us and them. You know what I mean? So it's like there has to be clear lines.
Many people's spirituality is to create an us and them. And so to me, I think what I realized was that's what hell does. It kind of solidifies that us and them with the most brutal, stark clarity. Like, there can't be a firmer dividing line than I'm going to go to heaven and you're going to go to hell. And so it creates that binary and that dichotomy, which I think ultimately robs us of the truth, which is that we are all God's beloved creatures. And it really it gives us sort of a spiritual sanction to look down on people. And really it leads to people living into their worst impulses to separate and feel superiority over others for being different or being outsiders. And so to me, it's not even just that hell misses it a little bit. It actually creates a spirituality that is the opposite of what I think true spirituality is. I want to feel more connected to my brothers and sisters in this world, not more superior and distant from. And then my goal is to change them and convert them and make them more like me rather than understand them and connect to them for who they are.
Yeah, there was one thing that stood out to me that I'd love to get a few more of your thoughts on. It was about the divided self, like the cognitive dissonance that can happen when we feel like there is a part of us that's bad because our religion, Christianity, the Bible tells us that it's bad. And this was specifically in your book. It was a section when you started talking about sexuality. Yeah. And dude, I have to tell you, I died laughing at that section because there was a reference in there to the Sears catalog.
Yeah.
Oh man. And any teenage boy, if you read the book, if you even hear us on the podcast right now, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I had this conversation with my wife just last week when I read it because we were lying in bed, she was reading, I was reading, and I cracked up laughing, and I had to go in and tell her all that was about. But anyways, we're going to leave that for everybody else. You can go read the book and figure out what it is that we're referencing. But in that section, that stood out to me just so clearly, that resonated with me so deeply, that the Christianity often has a tendency, I suppose, to pick out the parts to highlight things about us that we get this sense that are wrong. And you were specifically talking about sexuality because it is one thing that, in my experience, the church doesn't talk a whole lot about. It's kind of like, shoot to the side. It's never really, you don't hear it in a sermon. I don't hear it from the pulpit. I don't know if I really ever did. All I did hear was what you're not supposed to do when it comes to sexuality. Right. So the idea that I caught from your book was, that if there's so much of that going on and there's not this openness and conversation around it, then it's teaching us that there are parts of us that are wrong. So then what happens is we don't know what to do with that because it's natural to have a sex drive. It's natural to have thoughts, especially as like a teenage boy, you're going through puberty and whatever. And then you feel like that part of you is wrong. So you have to push that down, set that aside, but then you're like splitting yourself up. Basically, you create this cognitive dissonance where it's like part of me seems natural, but I'm learning on the other end that it's wrong, that it's dirty, that I'm supposed to be different than that. Can you say more to that?
Yeah. So I, got saved, became a Christian when I was like 5 or 6 years old. So by the time I'm going through puberty, I had already been a Christian for 5 or 6 years. Mm-hmm. And I was taught that sanctification, you're supposed to be growing more and more like Jesus.
Right.
And that yes, okay, Christians will sin, sure, but they won't continue in sin, right? And so I had this sense that, oh no, all of a sudden I had proof positive that I could not possibly be a Christian because it was getting worse, not better.
Sure.
And by worse, I mean, I was now experiencing lust for the first time, or my sexuality, it was everything that I was worried that, was true about me, that I was actually this bad, gross, wicked sinner.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, this can't possibly be me on my journey of sanctification. So I must not really be a Christian. And so every sexual impulse was a threat to my spirituality, was a threat to my salvation.
Right.
And that threat, like, it was the threat of hell. It was like, okay, this might be proof that I might not really be in, and I can't afford to not be in, because the stakes are just way too high for that.
Yeah.
And so that sexuality was a threat. I could not see that as a good thing. It was definitely a bad thing. And so when I would indulge in that, I would then feel guilty, and I'd feel like I had to pray another salvation prayer, because it's like, man, that's not the kind of thing a Christian would do. Certainly not the kind of thing Jesus would do. And so eventually, though, you begin to get numb, and that dissonance that you mentioned, you can't live in that constant state of fear and like loathing. So I ultimately kind of bottled it up, where I would have like some sort of a sexual experience, really just with myself. I wasn't sexually active, but, I would masturbate or whatever, or, look at a Sears catalog lingerie section. And then I would just have to sort of pretend that didn't happen, because I couldn't emotionally engage with that, because it was such a threat to my eternal soul, really. And so then it was like, okay, there was Sunday morning Brian and, Saturday night Brian. And it was like two different, and I just had to pretend that other guy, he's not in charge here. Like Sunday morning Brian, he's that's the real me. And what it didn't help me do was be integrated or learn how sexuality is actually a very important part of what it is to be human. It's certainly not a threat to my spirituality. It's actually one of the beautiful ways that we can connect with one another, which I think is the essence of spirituality, is connection. And so I do think we often rob people of experiencing healthy sexuality. I don't think purity culture is the only thing that fucks up people's sexuality. I think there's all kinds of ways that sex gets messed up for people, but I do think it's one of the particularly insidious ones, because when you couple, budding sexuality with the threat of punishment and being told that God hates what you're doing, and this could cause you to be cast into hell, that really, I think, is a crazy thing to throw at a boy who's just sort of going through puberty and forming those sexual desires for the first time. And that was me as a straight person. I make the point in the book as well, like, if I experience that cognitive dissonance and that fear and that really that shame over my sexuality as a straight person, I know that the queer kids in the church going through puberty had it much worse, because at least, even though my sexuality was seen as a sin when I would indulge in it, at least it was like the normal sin,
right?
Whereas they were made to feel broken just for really existing and experiencing any level of desire. And so that's where things like conversion therapy come in. And what I've often seen in my conversations with many gay kids who were raised in the church is they often go deeper in their spirituality than their straight counterparts, because fear drives them to feel like there's even something more deeply wrong with them. And so they end up doubling down on the sort of solution. Right? Because they're told that they're so deeply diseased, so deeply broken. And so they end up drinking double doses of that supposed cure, which is really no cure at all. It's just the same sort of conversion therapy mindset that something is wrong with you. And so you need to get saved. You need to be born again. You need to have the Holy Spirit, whatever the case, you need to be prayed over, et cetera, to be fixed. But what if nothing was wrong with you? And so that's no cure at all. It actually really just causes them to enter into a posture of self-loathing. And the worst part is that when you have that mindset, when you're hating yourself like that, you actually think you're doing a spiritual thing, because that's how God feels about you, you think. And so that posture of self-loathing can become associated with what it means to be spiritual, as opposed to learning how to love and accept the holy parts of yourself.
And that so clearly points out the difference that we're talking about here, the difference between like a religiosity and a spirituality, where like you're striving to be holy, like whatever it is you think that God is calling you to. So you're trying to cut out this part of yourself, when really what you want is to understand that part of yourself, to maybe better regulate that part of yourself, not to cut it out, not to consider it to be wrong. We're talking about like disintegration versus integration, like you just said, right? That's when we get healthy. That's when we understand ourselves. And that's when we feel whole, and we're not like you said, we're not doing that. This is Sunday, Brian, and this is the rest of the week, Brian. Right?
Yeah.
That's a wild way to live, man.
It is. And I think it's very normal when you have a fear-based spirituality to the point where that fear is kind of the essence of your spirituality, which is why so many people, when they begin to deconstruct something like hell, they often do throw away Christianity altogether because they are quite synonymous for many people. And so that was one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, not because I think everybody should stay Christian. I actually don't care how people identify. Some of my best friends, including my girlfriend, not a Christian. That's totally fine. But I think for many of us, we would love to hold on to some of the beautiful aspects of Christian spirituality. And it's particularly the person of Jesus. Still, I know very few people that deconstruct because of Jesus, what he said or did. Jesus himself is quite unproblematic for the most part. And yet people then, when they're deconstructing, they think that they have to throw the whole thing out. When in reality, I don't believe that most of what we've inherited, especially in evangelical Christian spirituality, accurately reflects the spirituality of Jesus. So I did want to sort of help people tear hell out of their spirituality without having to throw away Jesus if they don't want to.
Yeah. I've got a couple statements I wrote down. I wanted to get your thoughts on. That's cool. I'm just going to throw it out at you and see what you think. So, a spirituality based on avoiding punishment makes a man religious but not spiritual.
Yeah, I think so. I don't like to be totally negative on the concept of religion because I think people use that word in different ways. But I think the way that you're using it there, it is about dogma and control and making sure you believe the right things, quote unquote, right things. Yeah. Right. As opposed to what I think of spirituality is what connects you to God, others, and yourself. And the reality is that, and the Pharisees sort of exemplify this in the Jesus story, that you can be the most religious person and be really the least spiritual.
Yeah. What do you say to, well, maybe a better question is, have you had questions from men, maybe even pushback, when you talk about spirituality and what that means? Because at least I found in my experience, when I talk to some guys, not all, about the aspects of spirituality, love, connection, empathy, understanding, self-knowledge and self-discovery, it sounds woo-woo, to lack of a better term.
Yeah. Or even maybe feminine. You might even use the word.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think that religion, the way you're talking about it, sort of based on dogma, logic, systems, like reinforcing systems, hierarchy. I think those often do appeal to men who are often socialized to not value relationships the same as women. And so even just the idea of relationships itself is often seen to be feminine. But I personally believe that relationships are human and what we're all made for, and that we've really cut off an important part of ourselves when we say that that's more of a feminine thing. Because then to have a religion that's not relational means that what does your religion become for? Well, it becomes for enforcing power structures, for enforcing hierarchies, for enforcing control. If it's not promoting connection and relationship and love, then really it's there to create exclusion. And this is why one of the hallmarks of fundamentalist religion is they're always deeply patriarchal. The most extreme forms of this we see in sort of like the Taliban, right? Where women are so controlled, they're having to wear head to foot sort of, complete coverage. Yeah. They're not even allowed to let other men see a single body part or something like that. That's the Taliban. And Christians love to act like, that they're so evil over there in Islam, as if Christianity itself doesn't have deeply patriarchal aspects as well. Recently in the news, Doug Wilson, his movement, he's a pastor who Pete Hegseth, our Secretary of Defense, is a fan of Doug Wilson. So some very powerful people are looking to this guy, and he literally has the husbands in his church. He teaches the wives to submit to their husbands to the point where if they're not like having sex frequently and that sort of thing, the husbands are given spiritual permission to spank their wives, and like these kind of patriarchal systems. Fundamentalist religion usually does get used to enforce patriarchy and control and hierarchy. And so that's where it goes when it goes really bad. And so I do think it's very important for a religion to be about relationships and connection and what increases love. Because if it's not for that, well, what's it for? It usually is for domination.
This must be a big sticking point for you right now in just the political climate, because you've always lived in the States pretty much.
Yeah, always. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned before we hit record there in the North Carolina. I mean, everything that I see, I mean, up in Canada, we obviously have a different political system. We've got problems of our own, but we're all very much, I think, wrapped up in what is going on in your country right now. And I mean, even just the story that you just told me, I can't. I shouldn't be shocked or surprised that is this an evangelical, Doug Wilson?
Yeah, I think he would call himself evangelical. I don't think that is a normative evangelical belief.
Sure.
But what is pretty normative is male pastors, not, no female pastors. That's still, I would say, pretty common. I would say the majority of evangelical churches probably have a male only leadership team.
Yeah.
That would still be pretty common. And the idea that their wives are meant to submit to the husband, and sort of the classic, just a hierarchical picture or hierarchical sort of picture of, like, have you seen the umbrella picture where you have like the God being over the husband, who's over the wife, who's over the children, and you have these sort of like umbrellas of covering?
Not that specifically,
kind of
no. Yeah.
I think Bill Gothard came up with that one, but a lot of evangelicals like that because it is like, oh, we love this hierarchy, right? You have God, then the husband, then the wife, and the kids in this sort of line. And so for some men, they are attracted to religion for exactly that reason, that it says that they're on the top of a system of hierarchy and control.
Right, the head of the household.
And so that can be appealing. But that's not exclusively religion. I mean, the patriarchy exists in the world, even apart from evangelicalism, right? I think that's out there, but it's like the religion can often sometimes sort of baptize those patriarchal norms and say, oh, that's not just the way society has evolved because men have abused power. No, that's God's way.
Right, that's right? The right way. Yeah,
that's the way that God wants it. And when you bring God into it, I think he is even more dangerous, because you're then not able to say, hey, yeah, society has been male dominated for a long time, but actually that hasn't always led to flourishing. Actually, a lot of these countries, because of their sort of male aggression, are starting all these wars. And actually, the more women are empowered, the more peaceful and society becomes, the more flourishing we experience when we have mutuality and egalitarianism. But then they would say, no, but that's not God's way. Right. And so God is then used as this trump card to reinforce a hierarchy of male domination.
Yeah. And that I see that so clearly. I feel like I made the comment because you're obviously living there, but I see that so clearly in just the little bit of news that I allow myself to take in, because it feels overwhelming. What I see coming out of the Trump administration and just from the country on the whole, like this push for Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
It feels wild. Like I keep thinking that 10, 20 years from now, this period of time is going to be something that teenagers are going to be reading about in their history books.
Yeah. If we still have those, then I think so.
Yeah.
Assuming that, I agree. It does seem bizarre. And to me, it's crazy that, a lot of evangelicals would not feel comfortable calling themselves Christian nationalists. I would have to guess. I don't know what the exact numbers on this. My impression is that maybe 25% of evangelicals would be more explicit, full-throated Christian nationalists. I think a lot of them, there's just a mushy middle. But to me, a lot of those pastors who are watching this happen and saying nothing, I think we're at a silence is complicity moment where I don't know how you can watch the country going in this direction and you're not raising that alarm. Instead, they'll be just as likely to say, yeah, well, there's problems on both sides. You got the LGBTQ agenda over here and the sort of Christian nationalists over here, and we're just going to be silent in the middle. And they see those things as equally bad, as opposed to seeing the Christian nationalist threat for really what it is, Yeah. And so that's one reason I try to rock the boat, and I'm trying to call pastors to take this very seriously, because I think the majority of pastors probably don't love what's happening with the Trump administration, but they don't want to upset their base. They don't want to upset the older conservatives that give towards their churches. And so they tend to be silent.
Yeah, that's a real challenge. Hey, I was just thinking as you're speaking, like how, or is it even possible? How do we do it? But is it even possible to win those folks over, like those maybe on the far right, to a place where they can hear a conversation like this and think, yeah, you know what? Like maybe that is more helpful. Maybe that is better. Better if you're in government, maybe that is better for the people that I lead. Or if you're a pastor, maybe that is better for my congregation to think along these lines of connection and of love and of equality and acceptance rather than what I've been pushing. Like, is that a pipe dream?
What I tend to find is that people's eyes are usually opened only when it touches them personally in some way. And so women obviously they tend to be less conservative than men and less prone to this than men, because women's issues don't tend to be front and center in these movements, and they tend to be quite patriarchal. So yeah, the men voted for Trump more than the women. White men, most of all. If you're of any kind of minority, you tend to see it because you experience some level of oppression. I think the more that you experience those pain points within yourself and within your community, the more likely you're able to see it. And so that's why empathy is so important, because if you can't feel it until it's happening to you, I think we have an empathy problem. For a lot of people, the moment that the light bulbs come on is like when their kids come out, right? Their kids come out as queer in some way, and they're able to finally see it for themselves in that way. And I hate that it has to happen like that for people to get there. But then the really dangerous thing is when your kid comes out and you still don't get there. It's like, well, then you're really far gone. Like when you double down and refuse to experience empathy, even when it comes really close to home. And so, but yeah, unfortunately, and that's why I'm trying to always amplify voices on the margins, the people that are affected by this the most. I think we have to listen to them. I think that's what Jesus did. I mean, Jesus, he didn't just talk about the least of these. His whole ministry was about turning it upside down. The last shall be first. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And that idea of poor in spirit doesn't just mean like some spiritual concept. It is talking about the people that are crushed by society. In other words, not just financially poor, but beyond that. There's all kinds of ways that people are crushed by society. Women, people of color, socially excluded, sexual minorities. And I think the path of Jesus is actually putting those voices at the center and taking those that the society is labeling as last and putting them first and centering their voices, because that is, I think, the act of empathy that helps us build a society that works for everybody.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you that we do have an empathy problem. And that was one of the other things that I thought would be interesting. And maybe we could finish off on that. A good spiritual man is an empathetic man.
Absolutely. It's, that word is under attack. Did you know that there's some big Christian books right now that are like explicitly written against empathy? Have you heard about this?
Not books, but I've seen several pastors of bigger churches, like those who have a bigger following online, speak out against it, say it's demonic.
Stuckey is a Christian influencer. She wrote a book that came out this last year called Toxic Empathy. And then another book by a guy named Joe Rigney. He's not as big, but it was called The Sin of Empathy. And so both of those books were written in the last couple of years. And again, it is because they see the fact that compassion is kind of on the side of some of these more progressive ideas. Like I was just talking about, when I was giving that information about queer people doing worse and having worse mental health outcomes, worse suicidality and that sort of thing in non-affirming environments. So what do you do with that? If you believe that God says this, but empathy would lead you to say, hey, actually, maybe we should do the thing that doesn't make gay people kill themselves. Maybe we should actually treat these people like human beings and not create environments that make them want to die.
Yeah.
That's what empathy would lead you to when you hear the stories, when you're touched by them. And so that's why they have to kind of say, well, actually, empathy is bad. What's only matters is the truth. And so their truth is not really about what's most loving. It is about dogma. It is about an unchanging fixed dogma. And I mean, you can do that. Religion has always done that, but that's not what Jesus did. Jesus was very happy to deconstruct religious dogmas that were bad for people. And that was always on the basis of, I think, the best reason to change anything.
Yeah.
The being of the person in front of you.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I want to be very clear on what we're talking about here, because it can be misconstrued so easily. Empathy is the ability to understand and feel what another person feels. It does not mean getting into that feeling and accepting that feeling from as that's going to be like that person's present and future, and that's all it's going to be, and that's okay. Because anybody could be in a situation that isn't good for them and they're having feelings about that. It's one thing to understand what that person feels. It's completely another thing to enable that person to continue in that situation. You know, like just think of someone that's, abusing drugs, right?
Yeah.
They are feeling drawn back to the drug, right? They have that feeling, that drive, right? And you can understand that. You can feel that with them, that you can see it on their face. You can see it in their body language, right? That angst, that I need this thing. We know it's not good for them. We're not going to enable that. Right. We're not going to continue to push them down that path. Nobody would do that. That's a terrible idea. But I see so many, actually it was one of the videos that you shared, I believe, where it was a pastor that I forget his name. He was on a podcast and they were talking about.
They are always on those podcasts.
They were talking about that exact concept. They were saying that empathy is like, it's a sin because you're enabling the person to stay in sin. You're telling them that it's okay and you're showing them compassion, but it's not that at all. And Jesus did not do that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the obvious difference there is that, those drug habits they actually lead to death, that they lead to bad outcomes. And so we do, I think hearing somebody's story and entering in and humanizing them is just always a good thing. And that's the beginning of, I think, connection is to, if you're not even listening, if you're not able to actually receive somebody's story, then you can't empathize with them, even with a drug addict. I think our baseline has to be that, okay, like the first thing that we should know about them is that they're beloved children of God and they deserve to live. And so, I think of something like, communities having safe places to get clean needles. Mm-hmm. I think the conservative impulse is to say, wait, why would you give needles to a drug addict? Like, that's crazy. Well, if we know that dirty needles are killing them, then actually creating that safety, that's one thing we could do because people do deserve to live. And so that's not going to make them more likely to be addicts. It's going to make them less likely to die. And so having communities that even care about the life and the well-being of people like that's showing empathy, and not just the punitiveness that comes in as, well, they're doing a bad thing and therefore they deserve to die. Mm-hmm. That is, I think, a religious impulse that is kind of rooted in the idea that, God, obviously, is like, God sees bad people and sends them to hell. So that kind of gives me to create this sort of punitive world where when people are doing the things that I don't think that they should be doing, I don't really care what happens to them. I'm going to write them off. Yeah. But seeing people in their humanity understands, like, everybody has struggles. And I think everybody, like, we deserves to live. And so even empathy for drug addicts, I think, is really, really important. But especially with queer issues, I think that's where they're really afraid of empathy, because the fear is, like, this is what they'll say, the ongoing debate within evangelicalism is, can I go to my gay friends or family members' wedding, their gay wedding? And the pastors don't want you to do that. They'll say no, because that's, condoning their sin. Affirming. I think the real reason they don't want you to go is they don't want you to see their love, that they love just like everybody else, that their love is just as normal and real and true as any other love. And because that's really what changes us, when we realize, oh, this is just human. And so that's the last thing that they want you to do, because it's really hard not to experience empathy at that level. But that's what will save us. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't see how that could possibly be wrong.
No.
Being able to understand and feel what someone else feels, so that you could build a connection with them, however deep that it can be, however deep that it even needs to be. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do agree. I heard, I'm trying to remember where it was. I read recently about some country, it's probably one of the Nordic countries, because they're always doing really good, smart things that the rest of us should be doing.
Probably
but they
Norway.
Were like,
They've got to figure it out.
Teaching, in grade school, there was like a class on empathy. And like literally they were teaching kids about empathy and talking about different scenarios and role playing and stuff like that. And I was just like, wow, that's something that is not ever going to happen in America, at least anytime in the near future, because we're almost doing the opposite of that. Yeah. And especially our boys desperately need to experience empathy. But if we're telling them, and if what they're hearing is that's not masculine, masculinity is this dominant, aggressive posture where you're not really listening to anybody, then I think we're cutting them off from their humanity, and we're cutting ourselves off from a society where we can actually care about, especially the most vulnerable people.
Yeah, absolutely. Just go back to a point that you made earlier, that this is humanity. This is not masculine or feminine. This is not us versus them. These are all things that we all have. Like, yes, I could be more masculine than some other men. I could, lean to one side or another, but anybody can do that. And whatever it is that they're focused on in their task, in their job. You could lean more into the masculine side. You could lean more into the feminine side, but it is not feminine to be empathetic. It is not feminine to be in touch with how you feel and be able to understand what someone else might feel in a given situation. It's the ability to create connection. And that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
That's spirituality.
I agree. And I think it's the only pathway for healthy masculinity. I think it's what's missing. And, when I think of figures in the sort of alpha manosphere, like the Andrew Tate sort of figures, they really are treating or teaching men how to dehumanize as opposed to show empathy. And as long as we have that mindset that that's not a masculine trait, I think we're in trouble and we're doing our boys a disservice.
Yeah. They're like preaching this harsh stoicism, women as property, success is external, right? It's just money and power. And that's sad and sickening. And I hope we can turn people away from that.
It's not making them happy too. Like when has that ever made anybody happy?
No, that makes your ego feel good, right? That's really all that is stacking up reasons for you to think that you are something. And, every day you go out and you make more money or you use your power in some way, that's all ego. That's all thinking highly of yourself rather than being outward focused. And honestly, man, one of the reasons why I loved having the opportunity to chat with you and what you're saying in your book and several others online too, because since I've come across your Instagram specifically, you've introduced me to a couple of other influencers and just online folks that have a platform, and I'm so thankful for that. Cool. We're past the hour, but your book is called, let me read out the full title because I'm gonna miss out one word. HellBent, How the Fear of Hell Holds Christians Back from a Spirituality of Love. A former evangelical pastor explains why we can stop worrying about hell and start focusing on love. Awesome.
I loved your feedback, man. That was really encouraging. Not that many people have read it yet. And so that's always nice to hear how readers are experiencing the book. I'm excited for it to get in more people's hands here soon.
Yeah, it's personal. It's easy to read. It's academic without being heady. Informative. I think it's going to help a lot of people, man. I hope it gets into the hands of a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm trying.
Honestly. Yeah.
That's what I'm working on right now. So
yeah, for sure. You must be a busy man. Hey, you've been on several podcasts in the past little while.
I'm trying. I'm on my podcast tour right now, which means I'm just, saying yes to the people who invite me and trying to throw it out there to, anybody that'll have me on right now.
Right. If I think of anybody else, man, I can pass along your name. I'm assuming you got some spots in your calendar.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, Brian, it was great to meet you. I thank you so much for just being so quick to respond and just being real in the DMs. Honestly, I said that to my wife when the first time that we had scheduled on the calendar didn't work out, and you just simply apologized for like the calendar mishap. I said, like, that guy just like won so many points with me just simply by responding and being human. Like, I screwed up, calendared, had something else go on, would have been a bad day anyways. Just be real, right?
Yeah, I was sorry about that, but I'm glad we worked it out.
Oh,
thanks,
yeah,
you're great, man.
Not a problem at all, man. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thanks for the conversation.
All right, man. Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. I hope you found some value in this episode. If you have, be sure to share the Ockery podcast with a friend and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can find the Ockery on socials at The Ockery and on the web at theockery.com.